Hey, were you at the Minmay concert last night? Me either. But we're still going to talk about Robotech today on the Old Dragoon. All right. Last episode, we talked about the first role playing game I ever put my hands on, which was the Expert Edition of the Beckme set for Dungeons and Dragons. Today, we're going to talk about the first game I ever bought with my own money. Now, I was gifted several games before I made this purchase, but I was a huge fan of this show. So, long story short, when my parents divorced, my mom decided she wanted a little bit of a fresh start. So we picked up and moved from Texas to Florida for 1 year. And the most fortunate thing about that whole move was that, unlike my hometown around Austin, Texas, where Robotech never aired on TV, we were just outside Tampa, Florida, where Robotech had just gotten started. The year was 1985, and Robotech was the first real solid collaboration of bringing Japanese animation to the American audience and leaving as much of it intact as possible. Unfortunately, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy, and because Japanese cartoon series tended to be written beginning to end and then they'd stop. They weren't like American series where if something was successful, it just kept going and going. In Japan, they would make a sequel series rather than the original series just continuing on ad infinitum, sometimes well past its expiration date. Sadly, Supernatural and Stargate SG-1, I'm looking at you. I love you both dearly, but perhaps a few seasons too long. Anyway, Robotech. I was exposed to it. It was awesome. It was the first show I had ever watched where they made very much fewer changes than they did to other Japanese series that I was familiar with at the time. I loved Battle of the Planets. I really got into Voltron. I loved Mazinger Z. But a lot of the, well, sadly, violence native to those shows ended up on the cutting room floor when they were brought to America, to the point that they tried to pull a fast one on us with Voltron. And although Sven definitely died in the original Beast King Go Lion, and then his relative, I believe brother, came to avenge him, in America we were told, hey, look, it's Sven, he's back, because obviously the brothers had similar character design. Robotech was the first show that told us people die in war. There were some pretty brutal deaths, mostly of background characters. But, I mean, when Roy went, when Ben Dixon went, it was, this show was like serious. And remember, this was 85 when it came out. And the cool Tomcat looking fighters, these were totally not riffing off of Top Gun, not yet. These were there because Tomcats are awesome fighters. So, let's talk about the Robotech role-playing game from Palladium and see if it broke the kind of ground that the animated series did. Now, you'll notice that the cover of this book calls it Robotech, the role-playing game. Later editions from Palladium, and even the current game that's out right now from Strange Machine Games, specifically calls out that it's the Macross portion of Robotech. For those of you who are not familiar with the cartoon series, this is where I say no plan survives contact with the enemy. The Japanese shows tended to be, say, 25, 35 episodes, 36 in the case of Macross. That's not enough episodes to syndicate on American TV in the afternoons in the 1980s. You needed at least 65 episodes. Why that number? 5 episodes per week, 13 weeks, so that your series could repeat 4 times in a given year. That was how things were set up. And you'll notice that even the shows we all watched growing up that had multiple seasons, the later seasons were drastically shorter in most cases because you already had 65 episodes that you could throw on and rotate and then just add, say, 20 episodes for the later seasons. That did tend to happen with some of the animated series, which is why in our heads we remember the earlier episodes so much more clearly, probably because we saw them a lot. So when Macross was going to be brought over, it was too short. It was 36 episodes. So they took two other series that were visually similar because they were made by the same animation studios, and they put them together. So on one hand, they are much more faithful to the source material than, say, Voltron or Battle of the Planets, because they didn't shy away from a lot of the original plot lines, including people dying. Although there were a couple things that were edited out, like Roy with a bloody back and the Zentradi with the smoking crater in his back. Those were in the original Macross, along with a couple of shower scenes, but mostly. However, what they had to do while they were translating these shows into English was alter the dialogue from its original meaning so that the shows would be one long narrative, basically 3 generations of the same story. The second part of the story, Super Dimension Cavalry Southern Cross, took place on a different planet entirely, which was completely edited out to have it take place on Earth. So there were a lot of changes, but there are 3 separate eras of the original cartoon, not counting anything else that's been done since. Macross, which was the first series, the Southern Cross, which was the middle series, and what we tend to refer to as the New Generation or the Invid Invasion, which was patterned off a cartoon called Genesis Climber Mospita. The Robotech role-playing game came out without a subtitle, and it only covered the Macross era. Later books followed that covered the other eras and filled in some of the blanks in the middle. So what we're looking at here is the very first book, Robotech the role-playing game, that is going to cover the original Macross run, the first 36 episodes of Robotech. So let's dive into the book and talk about the role-playing game. So one of the things that graced the early Palladium Robotech books was some awesome art by Kevin Long. I loved a lot of his line art. This VF1S Valkyrie just looking like it's ready to take on the world. That was one of the first things I saw flipping through here. I knew I had to have this. All right, so moving in. The Robotech role-playing game has pretty much the page design, layout, and fonts that we will see from Palladium, all the way through now. There's a lot of similarities to how they did their books then to how they do their books now. Some people may complain about that. Personally, I like the fact that Palladium has been able to keep a low price point by not going to full color glossy books. A lot of their games have not changed price in years, with the exception that they've recently begun offering some of those books in hardcover that were only offered in softcover before. Palladium had a very straightforward, to the point way of designing their books. Could have been a little better organized, sure. Could have been a little prettier, sure. But it worked. So it jumps straight into an introduction to the world of Robotech. It jumps into explaining what role-playing is, and about some of the keywords that the Robotech role-playing game uses, including this does not have a straight-up D&D set of attributes. They're very similar, but the attributes each have their own names, and some of them, for a novice player, you could get a little bit confused, but we didn't have a problem with that at the time. So we jump right into creating a character. One of the issues that I had with this book as a kid was that wall of text. We jumped right into it, and it straddles a line. We figured it out. It wasn't not user-friendly, but it was nowhere near as user-friendly as, say, the slow introduction and choose your own adventure you find in Mincer's Red Box. So we did suss it out, but there was a lot of referencing back to some of these rules. And come to find out, there are certain things that are so buried within text that we played it wrong for 20 years before we figured out we were playing it wrong. That was specifically the physical prowess bonus. So, we're taking a look here. These are the bonus tables. Notice there are no penalties for low ability scores, only bonuses for high ability scores. And it's explained straight off the bat that you roll 3d6 to roll up your attributes, and if you roll a 16 or better, you roll an additional die and add it to that. So an exceptional attribute becomes really exceptional. Bonuses don't start until 17, meaning that unless you have modifiers coming from somewhere else, as long as you're exceptional, you're going to end up further up the chain than 17, mostly. I mean, you could roll a 16 and then roll a 1, but there you go. So, your IQ or intelligence, that gives you a percentage bonus to all your skills. So while combat is d20 based in this game, your skills are straight up percentages. Intelligence will give you a bonus to your skills. Mental endurance, which you could also identify as, say, willpower or the ability to resist torture, interrogation, mental effects. Mental endurance gives you a bonus to save versus psionic attack or insanity. Now, psionics aren't a thing in Robotech until the Sentinels book comes out, but Kevin Simbita had planned from the beginning for his system to be megaversal, for other games to be compatible. And so that's included here because psychic powers already exist in some of the other games. Some of the other games that use this same engine are like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Ninjas and Super Spies, Beyond the Supernatural, and even Palladium's original fantasy RPG. So there is a point to having things in there that you're just not going to run into in the Macross book. Your mental affinity, that is your charisma. And by that I mean straight up charisma, not the strange D&D amalgam between charisma and attractiveness, give or take that period when comeliness was a stat. So mental affinity is your charisma. You get a straight up bonus to have people trust or intimidate you. Physical strength adds to your combat damage. Physical prowess, that's your dexterity. That adds to your strike, parry, and dodge bonus. And this is the rule that we got wrong for all those years. It specifically says right here, shows the degree of dexterity and agility a character. A physical prowess of 17 or higher is rewarded with bonuses to dodge, parry, and strike. What is buried in the rules later is that is for weapons fired from a character's or weapons held in a character's hand. It explicitly does not apply to ranged weapons, which is strange because most of the games we play, your dexterity or physical prowess adds to your ability to use a ranged weapon. And so we naturally applied it for many years as a bonus with guns, with rifles, with mecha weapons, and then came to find out in a screeching halt when we ran across the rule in Rifts that no, that's not actually how that works. Never made sense to me. But we'll drive on. Physical endurance, that's sort of your constitution. It also serves as the base for your hit points. You get bonuses to save versus coma and poison. Physical beauty, this is the actual attractiveness stat. And then speed, which is for straight up foot speed, how fast you run. Now, in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, speed actually gives you a bonus for dodging. But in almost every other Palladium game I've ever seen, that's not a thing. Which is interesting because the system is megaversal, right? Okay, so moving right along, we have 3 to 18 stats with the possibility of going as high as 24 without modifiers from skills. So pretty straightforward. All of the bonuses are expressed in different ways, which works now, but it's a very 80s game design. So we have hit points and SDC. Hit points are hit points. Ow, I got hurt. I'm that much closer to death. SDC is structural damage capacity. This did not appear in the Palladium fantasy game until its second edition, but it is an extra layer of hit points that represents just physical toughness, physical conditioning. The way they explain it in the rules here is it's like a boxer has extra toughness reserves that don't represent him getting any closer to death. the character is just getting beaten around a little bit. Now, once the SDC is depleted, then damage starts going to hit points. Then the character is in trouble. So it's sort of a hit point cushion. I rather liked the rule at the time, but it can get out of hand if your characters realize that some of the physical skills you can take later really pack on the SDC. I'll explain when we get there. You find out that your character falls into a coma when they have run out of hit points, and that there are different percentages for recovering from that coma depending on how much medical assistance you receive. Also straightforward, also a very 80s game design in that there's special rules for everything here and there. This game introduced me to the concept of, oh, when you're hurt that badly, you might not recover all the way. So all of a sudden, my teenage brain is going, wow, this Robotech game is really more realistic than D&D. But, you know, that's how we looked at things back then. That's back when we were playing some pretty crunchy game designs like the Morrow Project or Aftermath. So there's some optional rules for different kinds of critical hits. We get into an explanation of mega damage. This is the one rule I hear people complain about a lot from this line and from Palladium's Rifts line, and I understand where the author was coming from when he wrote it. But it's the execution that was a little flawed. The idea being that some things in your world are going to be so tough that they can't be harmed by weapons designed for harming humans and brick walls and unarmored automobiles. So on one hand, you have structural damage capacity, and on the other hand, you have mega damage capacity. And something rated in mega damage can never, ever, ever be hurt by something that is not rated to deliver mega damage. So even at a 1 to 100 conversion, 1 point of mega damage equals 100 SDC or hit points. Even if you could deliver over 100 points of SDC damage with a heavier weapon, it's still not going to hurt the mega damage structure. The weapon has to be rated for mega damage to begin with. So I feel like that is a solid concept. Unfortunately, it was used in such a way that the numbers just got way too inflated. And we'll look at that as we go through the book. So we get an explanation of what mega damage and SDC is. We talk about picking your character class, which in this game is called an OCC, an occupational character class. And then here are Simbita's take on alignment, which I still like this to this day. One of his ideas is that there's no such thing as a true neutral. That everyone is at least looking out for number one. So you have good alignments, you have selfish alignments, and then you have evil alignments. There is a list of things that each alignment will and will not do based on their moral outlook. I also very much like this. I felt like it was a better explanation than what we got in early D&D books, which was really, at this point, that was what I was familiar with, because many of the other games that I played in my early days, like Traveler or Marvel Superheroes or TSR's Indiana Jones, there were no alignment rules in those. So alignment was sort of a D&D thing. Palladium Fantasy had it and had this same list. I really liked this system, and I don't shy away from it these days, even when I kind of don't pay a lot of attention to alignment unless a game setting requires it, say like Dragonlance. But so here's your alignments set up in Palladium's system. I do like that he specifically calls out Han Solo as an unprincipled alignment. I do like the aberrant alignment. That is an evil character with honor. And I very much like the way that is laid out, because it explains some of the characters that are actually in this series. They talk about Bretai and Exodor, the Zentradi commanders. They come off as evil because they are initially set against Earth, but they eventually find themselves to be more sympathetic characters and realize that the plight of Earth is their own plight, and they switch sides. So it shows that while they are evil in the same way the T-800 was in Terminator 2 Judgment Day. The Terminator would just shoot people until John Connor says, wait, you can't do that. And the Terminator says, why? Because it doesn't understand that indiscriminate killing is wrong until it's explained to him. That's sort of the aberrant alignment to me where Bretai and Exodor are concerned. They're genetically engineered to go out and kill things for the Robotech masters, but then they turn out to be not all that bad because they had a code of honor after all. And that's explained here. I wonder if D&D would call that lawful evil? Maybe. I don't know. But let's move along. So we have alignment. We have experience. Simbita explicitly calls out that experience is from experience. There is no gold for XP in this game. There is XP for defeating enemies, but you get a lot more XP for creative judgment, for ideas, for self-sacrifice, for dramatic things. And I really, really like that. There are insanity tables. Palladium did get in trouble for these insanity tables early on because the early versions of these insanity tables in a couple of their games, and I am looking at the tables right now because I don't remember if the early printings of Robotech were one of them, but there were a couple of things that appeared on those tables that to our modern sensibilities should not have been classified as mental illness. So, yeah. So we've got a lot of that. We've got the effects of drugs and addiction. Again, just reading this stuff, and it's kind of out of place to me because it's right up front. Like you're hitting this before you hit anything about mecha or anything about the character classes. This kind of clued me in as a kid. Again, wow, this is a serious game. This game is really taking things into account. Although you could say that the rules for alcoholism are totally appropriate here because Lynn Kyle in the Macross series struggled with alcoholism himself. So we've got some optional rules to roll up your traits, how tall you are, things like what happened to your parents. And then we get into the character classes. Now you'll notice one of the first things we see is requirements. You have to have certain stats to play certain character classes. They're not super restrictive though. It's not as bad as say trying to play a paladin in first edition AD&D. So we really never ran into these as being a problem. Here's what we did run into. So let's look at the character classes. The first one up is the Destroid Pilot. Destroids are awesome. They're big, stompy robots with lots of guns. Those of you out there that play Battletech, you might recognize the guy in the upper left corner. That mech is a Warhammer in Battletech. It's called an Excalibur here, but nowadays Robotech goes back to the original Japanese name and refers to them as a Destroid Tomahawk. There was a lot of confusion on the names of these things, partially because Battletech used them, and partially because Harmony Gold and Matchbox, their partner for making toys, came up with a whole different set of names, some of which overlapped than the originals had, and some of that survived into dialogue on the show. So Lisa Hayes actually refers to a Tomahawk Squadron, but the mech is no longer called a Tomahawk. It's now called an Excalibur. Anyway, the Destroid Pilot is referred to as the elite grunt of the Robotech Defense Force. This phrase appears in a couple of the other books. These are the folks that pilot these big stompy robots that do not transform. So, one of the issues for a game master in this game was if everybody plays a different kind of pilot, or some of them aren't pilots at all, how do you keep everyone together? What we normally did was structure our stories around a mecha team, like a team of people that have mecha at their disposal, but also have some specialists that may end up riding in a jump seat or what have you. But the Destroid Pilot only pilots the Destroids, which is cool. They can't learn how to pilot a Valkyrie or a Veritech fighter. They can pilot regular aircraft, but the reason I bring that up and hammer on it is because this should be a niche. This should be um, kind of this is what the Destroid pilot does and no one else does it if you're following the reasoning that they used for their Veritech pilot OCC on the next page. But they don't. Veritech pilots are the only people in this book that can fly a Veritech fighter. However, they and several other OCCs can learn to pilot Destroids, which kind of eats away at the niche protection of the Destroid pilot OCC. Why would you play one? Mechanically, that is, if you could pick up some of those same skills being a different class that would have a whole extra set of skills besides piloting the big stompy robots. So we very rarely had a straight up Destroid pilot because they weren't given anything aside from an initial choice of two Destroids that no one else got. So for versatility's sake, most players would make a different kind of character that also knew how to drive Destroids. The Veritech pilot. This is what most people coming into the game wanted to play. They all wanted the F-14 Tomcat-looking transformable fighters, plus the main characters in the series are fighter pilots, and the Destroids are really set dressing. In fact, we only see a main character pilot a Destroid in one episode of the show. So the Veritech fighter pilot is where it's at as far as, hey, I want to be able to take the sexy mecha out for a spin. The Veritech pilot gets the ability to fly the fighter. They can also learn how to drive Destroids as part of their other skills. So that kind of covers the need for Destroids in the campaign. A lot of people took that route. Now let's take a look at these two OCCs as for how you're going to use them to create a character. The first thing you're going to have is each of them has a set of OCC skills, which are skills that everyone in that job is going to get. For the Destroid pilot, it's pilot automobile, pilot mecha, all Destroids. The mecha combat skill, think of this as a weapon proficiency for a specific mecha for two different Destroids. The weapon system skill, a hand-to-hand combat skill, and weapon proficiencies with regular old rifles. Then they get to select 14 other skills, and there's a list of skill categories and which skills they can pick up. So you're going to see that as a recurring structure. Each OCC will have a set of OCC skills, then it will have usually more than a dozen other skills that are limited in certain ways. Very few of the OCCs can take any espionage skills, for instance. The military specialist can get them, but most other people can't. Mechanical skills are a little limited for the pilots, and pilot skills tend to be available with the exception of the Veritech. So, you choose a class, you pick up your auto skills, and then you have usually Destroid pilot gets 14, Veritech pilot also gets 14 other skills from different categories. You have a list of equipment that you're authorized upon assignment. You have a list of standard equipment that you are automatically going to start out with. You get a list of your wages. Now, it's funny that it says, hey, here's how much enlisted men make. Here's how much officers make. Nowhere in the book does it actually give you the rank structure in the Robotech Defense Force, which, again, has changed names. Nowadays, they call it the United Earth Defense Force, but back then, we all called it the RDF. And then you get an amount of personal savings. So there's the first two classes. Then we get into the Communications Engineer. This character is heavily laden with skills on computers and communications. They can learn to pilot Destroids. So this is one of those classes that tended to pop up is Destroid pilots that have other skills. This was also one of the classes that they assumed were people like Lisa in the show, or Claudia, or the Bridge Bunnies. This is the class that they assumed like a console operator on a Starship bridge would hold. So they get 16 other skills. So they get a little bit more discretionary choices than the two mainline pilots. The electrical engineer and the field scientist are very similar, except in their focus. The electrical engineer, of course, gets more electronics skills with 16 other skills. The field scientist gets 18 other skills. Both of these can also learn how to pilot destroids. Field scientist was one of my favorites back in the day. We get the mechanical engineer, who can also learn how to pilot destroids, and has a fair number of all of the... That's one of the issues with this system. There are so many different skills that are needed to fix mecha, and the rules for actually fixing the mecha are never explicitly explained. So mechanical engineering, mecha mechanic, weapon systems, pilot automobile, Veritech mechanics, like there's all these mechanic skills, and you don't ever know quite exactly which one to apply by the rules. So the GM usually just makes a guess out of it. So the mechanical engineer is an option. Now, what's interesting is while this one can choose how to pilot destroids, in later games from this line, the Defense Force decides that it is too dangerous to allow the engineers to know how to pilot the mecha, because once things go post-apoc, the engineer can then steal some mecha and go rent themselves out as a mercenary repair person while also piloting mecha. So later versions of the repair character can't learn how to pilot mecha at all. This one can, though. The military specialist is sort of the special forces character. And this is one of the only characters in the book with access to espionage skills. They still can't fly a Valkyrie, but they can pilot specific destroids. So this character is capable of being your spy, your James Bond, your recon person, and jump into mecha at need. Much like with early games, all of the character classes have different points at which they level up. Now here's the skills list. And this is part of the system that you either love or hate. Most skills are adjudicated with percentile rolls. But each skill potentially has a different base percentage and a different amount of percentage per level that it goes up. Meaning that during character creation, one of the most time-consuming things is once you've selected all these skills, then you have to go through the book and look up exactly what you start with and how far up it goes every time you level. More recent Palladium books have put these notations next to the skill names on the skill list page, but this version did not have that. I guarantee you that 2 out of my couple of copies of this game have them handwritten in just to save time. So these are all the skill categories, all the things that you can learn, and following that are specific examples of the skills. Now, what does slow you down, again, is looking for the base skill and the plus per level of experience, all of which are potentially different for every skill. But then when you hit, say, the physical skills, bodybuilding and weightlifting, halfway down on the right side, it adds 2 to your physical strength and 10 to your SDC. Boxing gives you an additional attack per combat round, a bonus to parrying and dodging, rolling with the punch, a bonus to your strength, and 3d6 SDC. So some of these skills are changing things that aren't just percentages on your character sheet, and potentially changing things that are going to cause you to go back and make new notes on your ability score bonuses. So yeah, the skill system was one of the things that we both loved and hated. And also, I've had more than one Palladium game master that's limited the number of physical skills that one could take, or caused each physical skill to cost one more skill slot than the one before it, to basically prevent people from taking all the physical skills that buff your SDC. It was possible to start with more than 100 SDC points at first level if you picked the right physical skills and rolled the right dice. So, the modern weapon proficiency skills, this section has been completely reworked in more modern Palladium games, but this gives you an idea of how to get strike bonuses with modern weapons since your physical prowess doesn't actually apply, and how burst fire works from machine gun type weapons. Now, there were a couple entries here that you could fudge. For instance, let me see, the empty entire magazine rules sometimes allowed you to do more damage than you actually had ammo in a weapon, because the rule didn't specifically say you had to have more than 10 rounds in a magazine. As a GM, I would put the kibosh on that, but a couple of the GMs I played with went, well, that's what the rules say, so let's go with it. So you have a set of modern weapon proficiency rules that applies to pretty much everything from revolvers to rifles to energy guns. Hand-to-hand combat is very interesting in this game. You have a certain number of attacks per turn. You will roll initiative every round. Your attacks can also be used to execute defenses, but when you do that, you lose out on making that attack later in the round. Like if you go full defensive, if you dodge every single attack that comes in, you may not have any actions left to attack with. Or if your attacker has more actions than you do, you may find yourself without an action to defend yourself with. Now, most characters who have actual hand-to-hand combat training, which is almost all the characters that I believe we've seen here, everybody starts with at least hand-to-hand basic, you get an automatic parry. You can parry with a weapon in hand or with your forearm or your fist for free. So you do get an opportunity to block an incoming attack. The basic roll to hit in this game is only 5. So a 5 or better on a d20 and your attack hits if all of the things are equal. But the opponent does get to defend at that point. And there are sometimes bonuses. There are dodges that take one of your actions. You simply have to roll higher than the incoming attack for the dodge to be effective. And certain characters have an automatic dodge, which works like the automatic parry. I believe the only thing in this book that has that is the Zentradi female power armor, the Quaidlin Rao power suit. I don't think anything else does, but they become more and more prevalent as the series goes on. So basically, combat continues in initiative order until everyone is out of attacks and defenses. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of all that. I like to use Othello chips and just flip them over for each character when an action is taken to show that when they are out of actions for the turn. But it is both very straightforward and a little complex at the same time. If you could handle Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, this isn't too bad. Where it gets even more complicated is when mega damage structures and mecha come in. This works really well in Palladium Fantasy, where you're basically fighting fantasy battles with swords and shields and, nothing more complicated than a bow or crossbow. When you're starting to get into the high-tech combat that happens in games like Robotech and Rifts, it can get a little confusing. So here are all of the keywords that they use in their combat. Here's listings of what the different hand-to-hand skills can do. You do have to keep track of this per level. Every time your character levels up, you look at the next line and see what they've learned. And though the game is not explicit about it, some of the things that you learn you did not have earlier. You kind of have to look down the chart to find it. Like, hand-to-hand expert at level 5 gets a kick attack that does 1d6 damage. Oh, so I really didn't have a kick attack until now. So critical strike on an 18 through 20. You could critical on a 20, but now you critical on an 18 through 20, sort of threat range, if you remember 3rd edition D&D. So a lot of this stuff you have to kind of read ahead to make sure you know what you can't do yet, as opposed to what you can. The mecha combat rules. So when you learn your hand-to-hand skill, like take a look at hand-to-hand expert level 1, I get 2 attacks per melee. And I get a bonus to roll with the punch, fall, or impact. All right, so I have 2 attacks. Mecha combat. Every different mecha has a set of mecha combat abilities that you can pick up as a skill. Let me find them. Here we go. Let's take a look at the gladiator combat training. Middle of the page on the left. 3 hand-to-hand attacks per melee plus those of the pilot. So now my first level pilot has 5 attacks, 5 actions per turn at first level. I get +1 to strike and parry. Great. I get +2 to roll with the punch on top of what I've already got. Those add together. I get to make a tackle with my mecha. My power punch does extra damage. So you see, everything is situational. So you have to look it all up and make notes on it. I know I sound like I'm complaining about the system. We played this a lot and had a lot of fun with it. And in fact, I am running it for my godchildren tomorrow. So it's not that I don't like the system. It's just that it is very much an artifact of the time in which it was written. So now we get into looking at the mecha. And this will show you what I meant when I said MDC was a great idea, but the execution was a little strange. So the first thing they show you, of course, is the Robotech fighter, because that's what everybody came here to see, more or less. So we get the history and the fluff for the Robotech fighter. Then we get into the stats for the Robotech fighter. So the Robotech fighter's main body has 250 mega damage. Now, each mega damage point is equal to 100 hit points, but remember, unless a weapon does mega damage in the first place, it won't hurt a Valkyrie or a Robotech, even if you can muster more than 100 hit points worth of damage, or SDC. So, okay, the plane, just the main body, just the fuselage of the aircraft, has 250 of these mega damage points. The lasers mounted on the front of the Robotech, which are arguably animation errors, but they did appear in an episode, so they're there. They do 6d6 per twin blast. That is, let me see, an average of 21 points on a hit. That means that air-to-air against another Robotech, you would have to hit it 13 times on average to destroy it. That doesn't sound right, especially in an animated series where these planes tend to explode if you look at them funny, especially if they have a brown paint scheme. The standard background character Robotech was tan and brown. The aces tended to have visually distinctive planes in given colors, like Max's was blue, Rick's was white with red trim, Roy's was white with black trim. Poor Ben Dixon got one of the straight up brown and tan Robotechs, and he got toasted. So one of your character goals playing this game should be to get a custom paint job as fast as you can. But what I'm saying is, while the concept of having armor that the average handgun or rifle is not going to pierce is perfectly cromulent to me, the numbers, the actual numbers, are way too high. For instance, most of the missiles the Valkyrie carries, if you are carrying air-to-air missiles rather than like heavy anti-ship missiles, they tend to do 1d6 times 10 damage. So an average of 35 points of damage with a missile. Again, you're going to need to hit this thing with multiple missiles to kill another one. When was the last time in a dramatic show that you had to direct hit an aircraft with more than one missile to destroy it? So the genre emulation of this game could have been better. We played the hell out of it and we enjoyed it. And there are little quirks in the rules. For instance, you can dodge up to 3 incoming missiles, but the rules do not allow you to dodge 4 or more. So of course, when possible, people fired 4 missiles at something, so it just couldn't dodge. 4 missiles with 1d6 times 10 damage would do on average 140 points. Still not enough to blow up another Veritech. So that's my main complaint. The idea is fine, but the actual numbers involved were a little out of whack. So you have the standard VF-1A fighter, the VT-1D trainer, which actually has 2 cockpit positions, the 1J, which was generally issued to aces according to this game, the 1S, which was issued usually to CAGs or squadron leaders, and then the Super Veritech, which has the armor pack added to it. There was also the Armored Veritech, which can't transform as long as it's got that armor on, but oh boy, howdy does it carry a lot of missiles. And then the rocket sled that lets you take a Veritech to orbit from Earth. So there's the main vehicle that most people are going to want to pilot in the game. Then we get into the Destroids. There's the Excalibur. And all the guns. All the guns. And those of you who are familiar with the Battletech interpretation of this mech, usually you guys never see the shoulders opened up with the missiles under that. They simply did not have the tonnage to put missiles on the Warhammer. So they always draw it with those boxes closed, because they're not boxes of missiles in Battletech. Once again, the main body is 300 mega damage points on the Excalibur, and those main cannons that it has in the arms that in the show tend to blow up what they hit do 5t10 plus 25 damage, so an average of around 52 damage every time you hit something. You would have to hit a like mecha with both cannons 3.5 times to take it out on average. So again, the numbers don't work quite so well, even if the system is solid. So the Gladiator, also known as an archer in Battletech. The Mach 2, which appeared as a sort of distorted miniature in Battletech called the Behemoth. Give you an idea of how big this mecha is. Those are 406mm autocannons. Those are the size of the guns on a late World War II battleship. So this thing is basically a battleship turret with legs. Doesn't move very fast, but it can put some serious hurt on target. Now, here's an example of the numbers going in the opposite direction, like in being not as much as you would think. The cannons only do 2d6 times 10 mega damage each, so 70 points of mega damage on average, 280 points on average. So there is a very real possibility that if you roll low on your d6s, all 4 of those 16-inch guns fired together at a Valkyrie might not kill it. All right, so moving right along. This one is a favorite in Battletech. It's called a Rifleman. Here it's called the Raider X, but originally it was called a Destroid Defender. This one has these ridiculously fast-firing autocannons, and so this one breaks the game rules a little bit. Whereas normally your mecha has the number of attacks that the pilot has, give or take a bonus for being trained. These are programmed, like with the combat computer, to fire up to 8 times per round. It's absolutely crazy. So this thing can do some serious damage. And then there's the Destroid Spartan, also known as the Longbow. also known as the Phalanx. It is a walking missile launcher. That is what it is there for. This was surprisingly popular with players back when I used to run this because of that rule where you fired 4 or more missiles, you were guaranteed a hit. Plus, this thing can carry heavier missiles than the standard D6 times 10 missiles. So it was pretty killer. We've got vehicles. The armor class space platform, which was the space cruisers built here on Earth. We've got the misidentified Lancer space fighter. That's actually a destroyer, not a fighter. That is a ship with a crew of a couple of hundred, not a single or double space fighter. So some of the translation was not entirely accurate in making this book. The Lancer 2 space cannon, the good old Star Goose space shuttle, the Cat's Eye Recon, and the Searcher, which I can't remember us ever using, but it was there. Here are some aircraft that were used on Earth during the war that happened before the alien spaceship crashed and everything changed. They have MDC and a fair amount of it. I would argue that pre-super alien technology aircraft could, yes, be damaged by machine guns, but that's how they chose to stat these out. The Ghost is actually a robot fighter. It's an AI-powered fighter with autocannons mounted in it. Even Rick Hunter's fan jet has mega damage, and that was a civilian plane that was wrecked by crashing into SDF-1. I'm just not sure that should have mega damage. Now, the Sea Sergeant is probably one of the few examples of aircraft in here where I can totally agree with the number of points it's given. It's given a main body MDC of 10. That's not a lot, but because it's MDC at all, it means that it can't be hurt by conventional weaponry. But if you look on its own listing there, the M89 12.7 millimeter air-cooled machine gun does do mega damage. 2d4 for a short burst, 44 for a long burst. So they're basically saying that the average 50 cal or larger machine gun does do mega damage. So you can shoot this thing down with a couple of bursts from a 50 cal. That works. That actually makes sense. Except that you would have to nearly empty that machine gun into the civilian fan jet with the giant bubble cockpit that Rick Hunter flies in order to shoot it down. Again, I'm not sure how the thought was put into some of these aircraft. The amphibious recon vehicle we used quite a bit in our games. Note that this is one of the few vehicles in the book that actually has heavy SDC. One could argue that that's what a lot of the smaller vehicles should look like. This motorcycle, the RDF motorcycle, has 1 MDC point or 150 SDC. That seems pretty realistic. It's going to blow up a lot in the game, but that's pretty close. All right, so moving along, we have a lot of weapons. Some of these are copy-pasted from other Palladium games like Ninjas and Super Spies, and then a couple of them are specific to Robotech, like that RDF submachine pistol that there's a picture of on this page. However, some of the equipment, like the laser pistol and laser rifle here, are either mistranslated or were misrepresented in the anime so that followed it to the role-playing game. Max identifies that weapon as a laser pistol in an episode. Actually, he calls it a laser rifle in the episode in which they infiltrate the Zentradi ship. It is actually a sort of rocket-propelled grenade weapon that was designed for Earth pilots to carry in their cockpit as a bailout gun because they were figured they're going to be fighting Zentradi. And so they have to have a weapon that would be roughly comparable against Zentradi. The weapon below it is not a laser rifle. It's an actual bullet bang bang gun. It's a slug thrower, but it was, again, identified strangely here. So we have all sorts of fun equipment. The multi-optics helmet was popular with my players because it gives you a bonus to strike. Also, somewhere in the equipment list is like, there it is, the portable laboratory. That was really popular with my players as well because it had all kinds of fun stuff that you could play with, like the refrigeration chamber, chemical cabinets, radiation dosimeter, like all of that kind of stuff. We get into the section on the Zentradi. It tells us a little bit about who they are and how they operate. There's the standard Zentradi assault rifle. If you hold the trigger down for the entire melee round, you're going to do, on average, 14 points of damage, meaning your players have relatively little to fear if they're in a Destroid or a Valkyrie, a Veritech. So that is one of the problems with this game, is there was a heavy grind on taking out the PCs. They very rarely felt in real danger. So, we fudged it a lot. So here's the enemy tactical battle pod. It only has 50 main body MDC. So it's going to pop like popcorn compared to Earth Mecha, which, to be fair, it popped like popcorn in the show, but not as much as you would expect. Often you see these things exploding when they're hit by a burst from the chain gun, the gun pod on one of the Veritechs. The only way you can do that in the role-playing game is to engage in a full melee attack where you are holding down the trigger for the entire 15-second round, and then only if you roll a 5 or a 6 on your d6 damage. These things are much, much tougher than they appear in the show, even with the relatively low number of mega damage points. In return, they're probably dealing their 8d10 damage from the 2 heavy particle cannons, which is roughly, 44 damage on an average attack, which is, a little less than 1/5 of the main body hit points of a player's fighter. Again, often the players just don't feel like they're in a lot of jeopardy. You have to kind of be a jerk as a GM and target one person a lot to make the players feel like the battles are tough. That or just throw ridiculously overwhelming numbers at them, which is pretty true to the show. Zentradi tend to attack in very large numbers. There are versions of the battle pod with missiles. That makes them a lot more dangerous. There's the recon scout pod that can provide reconnaissance to its allies. The officer's pod, known as the Marauder to Battletech players, where you're in trouble. This thing has a heavy particle cannon on it that will actually make Earth Mecha sit up and take notice, and generally the pilot will be better. Now that is one thing that this game could have used, is a set of standard stat blocks for the pilots that you'll encounter, because you can figure it out by using the stats of the Zentradi, figure out their level, figure out their hand-to-hand skill, look at the mecha combat training for this mecha, and okay, now I know what the attack bonuses are for the battle pod against my players. But we had to reverse engineer that. There really wasn't like an explicit, hey, here are the final bonuses that these things are going to attack with. Powered armor. The male powered armor was okay. The female powered armor was absolutely bad news. It had tons of missiles and a ridiculous damage bonus. These were elite troops for the Zentradi, more accurately the Meltrondi, the female cloned warriors in the series. So here's some other Zentradi equipment, including their fighter pods, which was given a force field, probably based on the way the animators drew the shockwave off the bow of these fighters as they entered atmosphere. Later notes say, no, there was no force shield. But in this game, force shield exists. Makes these things really, really a lot tougher. Roll for Zentradi villains. Stats for Zentradi and how to create battle pod pilots. We get into a little bit of the world building. Unfortunately, this is all there is for the world building. Some random adventure scenarios. Now note, take a look at these numbers. The Zentradi forces in this adventure. 1 battle pod, or 1 officer's pod, 5 battle pods, 20 more battle pods that have been damaged and made to look like they're in perfect condition, but aren't. 22 Zentradi foot soldiers, 28 foot soldiers, with actual weapons, 3 of their transport pods, and 5 power armor Zentradi. That's a lot of bad guys. But that's what it took to really make your PCs feel like they were in trouble. So here's a glossary of terms and the infamous Japanimation side note. So back before the word anime was common over here, Japanimation was a common term for imported cartoons from Japan. I loved this section as a kid because I was reading over it feeling like I was getting insight into, you know, the deep knowledge, right? The deep knowledge of the origin of Robotech. And so while a lot of this is very strangely translated, it is pretty interesting to read. So here's the stats from some of your characters from the show. Here's the stats for the actual SDF-1. I love the damage rating on the main gun. Absolutely destroys everything in its path of fire. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you know, you could be like the Dragon Ball Z role-playing game and ask me to roll several thousand D6s, but you're just gonna, yeah, absolutely destroys everything. I kind of dig that. And that is Book 1 Macross. So, it took us a little while to figure this one out, but not too long. It was a little more complicated than Dungeons and Dragons for us, but we were highly motivated because we really loved Robotech. At the time, we only really had access, once I had moved back to Texas, to the first 3 episodes, which you had to rent from the local Albertsons video. Each episode was released as a single episode on a single VHS tape. It wasn't until a couple of years later that FHE released a extremely butchered version where it fit into all of Macross onto 6 tapes, but they did a lot of editing to make that happen. So we basically had the first 3 episodes that we could watch over and over and over again, and then what was in this book. We also picked up the Robotech art books, which had some interesting information in them, and pretty quickly Palladium released the rest of the line. 1 book for Southern Cross, 1 book for Invasion, and this particular book got the RDF manual, which we might cover in a future episode, and an adventure module called Ghost Ship, which we might go over because I'm a big Robotech nut, and though there are tons of games out there, I like this one. Now, I will say that there's got to be a more elegant way to do it. I will say that I tinkered a lot with the actual MDC numbers. I didn't really mind the game engine itself. You know, strikes and parries and dodges and this many actions per turn. I could handle all of that. It was the actual disparity in the numbers that bothered me even as a teenager. Because the game simply didn't play the way the show worked. However, in my old age, I have found a certain interest in playing games as they were written just for the nostalgia value. You know, acknowledging that some of the factoids were wrong or some of the numbers were off, and just playing the game the way it was written. In fact, Robotech is on that list. One of these days, we're going to go over the Robotech 2 The Sentinels book, which was based on some of the early concepts of what were going to be the Sentinels cartoon, which never happened, which has been back and forth through novelizations and comics, and now is being revisited again so that a book on it can come out from Strange Machine Games for their new Robotech line, which we may also cover. So things have changed. Concepts have changed. The Paratonians are no longer wizards, for instance. But there is a certain nostalgic warm fuzzy that I get thinking about, okay, I want to sit down with my friends with that Sentinels book and run the game as the game was written, not the corrected version that's in my head. Just to get back to the way we did it back when we were in middle school and high school. But that's a discussion for a later episode. What's your experience with Robotech or with the Palladium system? Do you agree that there's a serviceable system under the hood if you make a couple of changes? Or are you one of those people that feel like the whole Palladium system needs to go back to formula? How do you feel? What do you think? Reach out to me in the comments below. Once again, I'm the Old Dragoon, and remember, character is what you are in the dark. See you all around.